Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Tonight's program is on the impact of election 2020 on U.S.-Asia relations. The future of the U.S. relationship with Asia could look very different depending on the outcome of the November elections. Whoever wins the presidency will drive U.S. engagement around the world, setting policy on numerous global challenges, including trade, energy, and security. To address some of these topics, we're very grateful to have with us two experts with deep knowledge and insights given their experience and background. Dr. Victor Cha is Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He serves as the Korea Foundation Chair in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Cha has also served as Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council from 2004 to 2007. Dr. Evan Medeiros serves as the Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also advises multinational companies on China in his role as Senior Advisor with the Asia Group. Dr. Medeiros has served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council, and also served as President Obama's top advisor on the Asia Pacific. Our moderator is Dr. Eddie Allen. He's co-founder and senior partner of Eagle Global Advisors, an investment advisory firm in Houston. He also serves on the board of the Asia Society Texas Center. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society is an educational institution promoting cross-cultural understanding for a more inclusive world. Because we believe in the importance of having access to diverse communities and perspectives, many of Asia Society's programs, like this one, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243-725. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Selena. I'm Eddie Allen, and thank you for joining us, those of you out there on YouTube and Facebook. I'm very excited tonight to be joined by two really knowledgeable and experts, one of whom served under George W. Bush and one of whom served under Barack Obama. And so both can give a fantastic perspective on all the events that are going on, and hopefully a little twist on how it might be different under a Republican versus a Democratic administration after the election. But I guess one issue that's been big in the Trump administration and one that's been of interest to a lot of our members and participants has been North Korea. President Trump took a very unorthodox direct approach to have an overture to North Korea, but it's hit sort of an impasse, it appears. I thought I would ask Dr. Cha, who was, George W. Bush's advisor on Korea affairs, North Korea in particular. If Trump wins, where does Trump go from here? And if Trump doesn't win, if it's the Biden administration, can they do anything to change the dynamic with North Korea?
Well, thanks, Eddie. First, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here tonight with you and with Evan at the Asia Society in Houston, Texas. I remember visiting the facility several years ago, and I'm sorry that we have to meet like this on Zoom, but I guess that's what we're all doing these days.
Yeah.
on North Korea, you're right. I think President Trump took a very unorthodox approach with regard to North Korea. In many ways, for those of us who've been in these negotiations with North Korea or studied them, Trump was really testing the hypothesis that had not been tested yet with North Korea, which is to say, we had two agreements with North Korea, one under the Clinton administration and one under the Bush administration, that were made largely through working level experts, but never really christened at the top by the two leaders. And for this reason, everybody said the reason those agreements failed is that you never had a handshake agreement between the two leaders. And how could you not do that since North Korea, there's only one person who makes a decision in North Korea, and that's a dictator. And so Trump in many ways tried to test that hypothesis, with all of these very ornate and attention-gathering meetings in Singapore and then in Vietnam and then in Panmunjom on the border between North and South Korea. But as you said, Eddie, these things were they got a lot of attention, a lot of media attention. The TV ratings, as President Trump said, were amazing for these things. But in some sense, they really didn't accomplish much. And if anything, the situation has gotten worse because North Korea has stopped overt missile and nuclear testing, long-range ballistic missile and nuclear testing. But all the indicators are that since 2017, they have just grown their programs, whether you're talking about ballistic missiles or nuclear material or nuclear weapons themselves. We did a study at CSIS, a satellite imagery study at CSIS of one of their uranium concentrate plants, which is how they produce the feedstock for nuclear fuel, from which they then separate out weapons-grade plutonium and uranium. And that facility was not just up and running; it had been expanded over the past few years. So there's still a lot going on in terms of that, and really sort of no real results. Having said that, I think if Trump were to win the election in November, one of the first things that he would do would be to seek another meeting with Kim Jong-un and reach some sort of incremental agreement that for the experts would mean nothing, but he would certainly make it out to be the best deal ever. And I say this because, and I was actually just in another event with last week, or maybe it was early this week, with someone who's actually very close to the Trump administration, Trump campaign, and they basically said that this is the one issue on which Trump went all in. He really went all in on this issue, and it's a loose end. And apparently, for whatever you think, Trump doesn't like loose ends, and so he's going to want to button this up as soon as he wins the election, which frankly could be a frightening thought, and we can talk about reasons why. If Vice President Biden wins the election, I think, Evan could speak to this too, but my guess would be that they wouldn't completely reject the idea of summit meetings out of hand, but it would be something that could be considered much further down the process after a really substantive and expert set of negotiations that made real progress towards, capping the fissile material, preventing more nuclear tests, and giving up the facilities, the major facilities that North Korea has. Maybe under those conditions, they might consider that sort of meeting, but it would really be about substance more than about show, and would really try to seek to stop what is currently an unrestrained program.
Well, let me ask you, let's go to Dr. Medeiros. What do you think let's say Vice President Biden is elected, what would his goal be? It seems like Trump had the goal of, he thought he could get North.
For inviting me here. I think Asia is becoming like what Europe was during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's really going to be the centerpiece of American foreign policy going forward. I'm glad that you and all of the listeners today are focused on Asia as an important foreign policy issue. And as somebody who's a senior fellow at the Asia Society's Policy Institute that Kevin Rudd runs in New York, it's always a pleasure to share views with your members. I don't speak for the Biden campaign, so I can share my views based on my experience of working with Vice President Biden in the Obama administration. I would say their goals at the outset would largely be to freeze the program, to contain its growth, and to deter North Korean provocations, nuclear, missile, and disruptive covert action programs, specifically against South Korea. The question is, do you do that through the diplomatic track or do you do it through the pressure track? I think there's a lot of skepticism that Kim Jong-un is going to be willing to negotiate away this program. And while Victor, I think, is spot on that sort of a magical threshold has been crossed with with Trump meeting Kim Jong-un, that means that I think the bar is lower for the next president if it's not Trump. I think that North Korea is going to have to show some seriousness of its intention. And I think that's because China's approach to North Korea has so radically changed in recent years to a sort of full embrace of North Korea. I think it makes it gives North Korea that much more negotiating room. So, I think a lot of it will depend on North Korea's posture in the first 6 months. Does it do what they did in the Obama administration in 2009, which is conduct nuclear tests and missile tests and sort of press and probe to see how a new administration is going to respond? If that's the case, I think the administration will try to recreate the pressure track. I think it'll be incredibly difficult, in large part because of China's posture, but we'll see.
Well, what would success look like? If we go back to a Democratic administration, they have the history of the Iran agreement, which sought to get those goals that you mentioned, arrest the development of the program, kind of freeze it in place. Is that an achievable goal? Is that a goal that you think Biden administration would pursue?
I think they would pursue it. I'd love to hear Victor's view on whether or not it's achievable. I think it really depends on North Korea and whether or not North Korea's what North Korea wants for freeze, containment, etc.
Well, let's go back to Dr. Cha. What would you say to that? What do you think North Korea wants?
I think in the end, North Korea would like an Iran deal. They would like an Iran deal. They would like an India deal. They would like some deal that on the one hand does restrain some of their capabilities, but on the other hand may give them the opportunity to squirrel away some of those capabilities so that they can retain a nuclear deterrent while getting all the benefits. So they would like to have their cake. They'd like to have their cake and eat it too. The North Korea has always approached the negotiation and said in negotiations have said that this is not about this should not be about denuclearization, because when you say it's about denuclearization, you're talking about just one side, and that this should really be an arms control negotiation, which is what they believe it is. They're a nuclear weapons power. The United States is a nuclear weapons power. This should be sort of an arms control negotiation between two nuclear weapon states, which means they expect to be, treated as a de facto nuclear weapon state. On the whole question of what they'll do if Vice President Biden wins, so we have looked at this question of North Korean behavior during U.S. election years. Midterm election years and presidential election years, and there's a very clear pattern that North Korea conducts more provocations in U.S. president election years than not, and there is, I think, a very good chance that if Vice President Biden wins, that North Korea will be true to form and will carry out some provocations first to get to become the front burner issue. Because they want to get the attention of the United States to take them seriously, and two, probably to try to leverage the threat to get things, because their economic situation is quite dire now. Their food situation is quite dire, and who knows where they are in COVID-19 right now. It sounds like they're concerned about that. If Trump were to win, I think that they would not do provocations because they clearly want Trump to win, because they want more of those, symbolic, meaningless summits that all have the effect of sort of giving them de facto recognition as a nuclear weapon state. If the U.S. president sits down with the North Korean leader and talks about denuclearization, but nothing really happens, it's just further de facto acceptance or recognition or resignation to there being a nuclear weapon state. So it's possible that we could see fireworks if Vice President Biden wins, and that instead of fireworks, we might see one of these early summits between Trump and Kim. But like I said, that's not a particularly good thing. That's not necessarily a good thing either, though.
If I could just come into this, I completely agree with Victor's analysis, and I encourage you to look at the work that he and his team did. He reminded me of it when he mentioned it, that the calendar works a little bit in our favor, because in July of 2021 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Huge, massive celebration for the Chinese. The Chinese are not going to want nuclear test, missile tests, and a regional security crisis during that time period, right? In winter of 2022, the Chinese will be hosting the Winter Olympics outside of Beijing, right? They will not want a major crisis in the lead up to that for obvious reasons. And then the next party Congress in China, which will, theoretically choose the next leadership. I don't think it will. I think Xi Jinping is going to stick around, will be in the fall of 2022. So the Chinese have lots of very good reasons to continue to play to continue to put pressure on the North to avoid provocations. Now, to what extent they've communicated that with the North Koreans, to the extent the North Koreans understand that, I don't know. But I think that that's an important calculation that has to be factored in when looking at scenarios for the next 24 months.
Well, let's turn to China. I was intrigued by your statement that China has embraced North Korea more than it has in the past. And I remember a few years ago hearing from some experts who said China was fed up with North Korea, that North Korea would do these provocations during Chinese New Year, and all the officials who wanted to be with their families would have to rush back to Beijing to deal with a North Korea situation, and they had it with North Korea. What has led to this turnabout in Chinese attitudes towards North Korea, would you say, Dr. Medeiros?
So I think it's pretty simple. I think it has to do with Trump's strategy, in particular, his first meeting in Singapore and then the subsequent one in Hanoi. For China, the only thing worse than North Korea getting nuclear weapons and destabilizing the neighborhood is North Korea, with or without nuclear weapons, tilting towards the United States. The thought of the Korean Peninsula with a American treaty ally and a North Korea that is somewhere between indifferent and oriented toward the United States is simply a strategic reality the Chinese are not willing to countenance. And so, as a longtime watcher of Chinese statecraft, it was striking to me the embrace that the Chinese gave Kim Jong-un when he went there, for a visit right before the trip to Singapore. In fact, they made a documentary of it. And it's, it was, if President Trump got a state visit plus, Kim Jong-un got state visit plus with sprinkles, whipped cream, and multiple cherries on top.
Okay. Well, one thing we haven't even talked about is the possibility under a Trump administration that Trump would pull American troops out of South Korea. That was a revelation, I guess, in the recent book by former NSC head John Bolton, that Trump kept raising that as a possibility. Let me ask you, Dr. Cha, what would be the impact of that? What does even that statement say? Saying that statement, what impact does that have in that part of the world?
Well, I think it would be a very consequential move if the United States pulled troops out of a frontline military ally like South Korea or Germany, for that matter. Look, there is a clear record that Donald Trump does not believe that U.S. alliances and U.S. troop commitments to countries like Germany and South Korea and others are in U.S. interests. Again, we scraped the data going back to 1990. And from 1990, he was saying the same three things, which is the United States provides these very wasteful security assurances to other countries, these allies. They free ride off our security commitment, and they cheat us on trade, right? And that's been sort of consistently something that he's believed in since 1990. And he said it during the campaign, and he said it in one of his first interviews when he became the president. And so we've seen this in the way he's treated allies like South Korea and Germany. In the case of Germany, he's already said he wants to draw down 7,500 troops, doesn't think the Germans are spending enough on NATO or on national defense out of their GDP. And in South Korea, we've been bogged down in this very long negotiation where the Trump administration is demanding that South Korea pay 5 times the costs of burden sharing for keeping U.S. forces in Korea. So he sees this as a way for the United States to profit off of these sorts of things rather than simply to be providing a security commitment. I believe, and I mean, I can certainly be challenged on this, and it's just my own assumption. It's not based on any data except the data I've just talked about, that if we have a second term of Trump, I think he will pull troops out of Korea. And that he'll pull troops out of a lot of places, I think. And what sort of message would that send? I think for many companies, investors that look at places like Korea as good investments, there really isn't much of a shock to the system or to markets when North Korea does another missile test or a nuclear test, because I think many folks have already factored that risk into their investments. What they really watch is what the United States does. And if the United States started pulling troops from different parts of Asia and reneging on security commitments, I think that would create a real shock in the system that would not just affect politicians and foreign policy, though it would affect markets. I think it could affect a whole variety of things. And moreover, it would cause China to feel quite confident and perhaps cause them to overextend in places or miscalculate and overextend in places like Taiwan, for example. So there's a lot that could come of a second term in which Trump tried to implement or execute this America First policy, where troop commitments really don't augment U.S. power; they detract from it, and that's why he would like to pull them out.
Well, let me. We're getting some questions that are coming through on the chat here on YouTube and Facebook, and one is directly relevant on this. What has been the direct impact on the relationship between the United States and South Korea from Trump's overtures, and I guess also these statements about the possibly pulling out troops or charging more for the troops? Is that how do the South Koreans, how are they reacting to this changes in the relationship? Dr. Cha, maybe you could address that first.
So it's interesting because on the one hand, there are many South Koreans that applaud Trump's efforts to meet with Kim Jong-un. Not all, but there are many South Koreans who applaud that effort, particularly on the progressive side of politics, because they are very motivated by the desire to reconcile with North Korea. So on the one hand, I think many applaud him for trying to do that. On the other hand, this effort really to try to extort, $5 billion from South Korea for troops is not going over well in South Korea. I mean, I hate to keep referring to data, but I'm a social scientist. So, but we actually did a study where we looked at on social media every time there was a story about SMA negotiations, SMA conflict happening. We tried to scrape social media to see what the reaction was, and actually, when there was talk about $5 billion demands, Americans being very greedy, all these sorts of things. The engagement on social media with anti-American and anti-USFK, U.S. Forces Korea chat groups and things of that nature reached an all-time high. It spiked at an all-time high. Now, this is not to say to the listeners and viewers that South Koreans are anti-American, because they're not. I mean, the majority. So, the United States has one of the highest support rates of Asian countries in South Korea. I mean, one of the highest. But when stories like this keep hitting the news about, you must pay $5 billion or else, or we'll pull troops or something like that, it naturally tends to grate on people. And even those people who defend the alliance have a tough time defending it, when this sort of thing is happening. So, and the other thing I would say is that it's something that's followed very closely in South Korea. They pay a lot of attention to SMA negotiations, burden sharing negotiations. And of course, nobody pays attention to it here in the United States, right? The average American doesn't pay attention to it, which is, again, a source of a great deal of misperception, where one side looks very angry and the other side's like, I don't get it. What's going on here? Why are they so ungrateful? Because we're protecting them. You get that sort of perception gap too.
Let me go to Dr. Medeiros about this issue about how China reacts possibly to the U.S. Threatening to take troops out of South Korea. China certainly seems to be more aggressive in the region. What's behind that, and how is that? What would a Biden administration versus a Trump administration? How different approaches do you think we might take against this more forceful China?
Sure. Well, there's sort of two questions there. Let me take the South Korea question first, and then the China regional question. In terms of South Korea, the Chinese would absolutely love for Donald Trump to remove troops from South Korea, right? It's doing China's work for it. The Chinese have long seen the U.S. alliance and troop presence in South Korea as a threat to them. They feel as if the Korean Peninsula is basically it's within their sphere of influence, and they want to control it. That's why they reacted so negatively to the prospect of Trump and Kim Jong-un negotiating. So for the Chinese, they would be ecstatic if that would happen. In the Biden administration, during the campaign, they've already been crystal clear that one of the first foreign policy initiatives would be to re-embrace, update, and modernize U.S. alliances in Europe and in Asia. And I traveled with Vice President Biden in the fall of 2013 to Japan, South Korea, and China. And, as a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who was deeply steeped in the Cold War and arms control negotiations, it didn't take him very long to understand the nature of the security challenge on the Korean Peninsula, the role of U.S. forces, the needs of the alliance. And so I think we would see an expansion and an updating of that, of the military relationship between the U.S. and the ROK, and the U.S. and Japan under a Biden administration. So very, very different than a second term of the Trump administration. And to link that to your second question about sort of responding to China in the region, I think there's a belief among specialists that there are many motivations for why China has sought to throw a few elbows in the region, in terms of being more aggressive with Japan over the East China Sea, with Vietnam in the South China Sea, and even with India on the border in the western section. And I think one of it is they simply see the United States as being less interested, active, attentive, and influential. And I think the Chinese see our allies as a little bit vulnerable. Because the United States has been distracted, and because the United States has injected, or Donald Trump has injected, stress into those relationships. So the Chinese are sort of probing and testing what the boundaries are. combined with, I think under COVID, they wanted to send a very clear signal that despite the domestic challenges associated with COVID, that they didn't want anybody to see that they had that distraction could be an opportunity to be exploited. So, to be clear, I don't think the Chinese were being opportunistic in the sense of, hey, Japan, Vietnam, India are distracted with dealing with COVID, so let's see what we can get. I think it was rather the system over-interpreting Xi Jinping's instructions to stay firm, stay clear, don't let anybody exploit our preoccupation.
Well, we're also getting a number of questions about economic matters coming through, and this is relevant. We're in Houston, where the Chinese have had to shut down the Chinese consulate here on charges of industrial spying. Not really sure where that came from or what that was about. But what do you think is the chance under, or how will it be different in terms of the approach to the economic challenge that China presents to the United States in a Biden versus a Trump administration in the next 4 years? Dr. Medeiros.
So I think it'll be substantially, if not entirely different. I think it won't be, while there is a broad recognition that the scope and the depth of the China economic challenge is very, very significant. I think there's also a recognition that the U.S. has accomplished nothing with the trade war, and in fact has hurt American consumers and American businesses by using tariffs. And so I think the economic approach of the Biden administration would be, number one, do a lot of investment at home, because the best way to compete with China is to ensure that America can run faster and simply outcompete. So there's a lot of discussion about investing in infrastructure, investing in education, investing more in R&D. So it's about making America a better competitor. Number two, I think there's certainly interest in using unilateral trade remedies, so sort of targeted tariffs where they can be effective. But I also think there is a broad recognition that multilateral trade agreements, especially ones that create regional standards, higher standards on issues like the behavior of state-owned enterprises, government procurement, trade and digital services, agreements like that are going to be most effective for shaping Chinese behavior over the long term. So the idea is, if you get agreements that span both Asia and Europe, so 60% of the global economy, and the Chinese are outside of that particular bubble, that creates a strong pressure on them to conduct the internal reforms to join the rest of the world. And there's strong historic precedent for that in the economic reforms the Chinese made in the 1990s in order to join the WTO.
Paul online asks on this particular subject, what about it was called the TPP, and now it's called the CTPP, the second iteration of the TPP. Is it possible that the U.S. might take a look at that again and, be part of that multilateral trade agreement that doesn't include China, as I understand? It basically just includes the countries around China, but is somewhat seen as a way to respond to the Chinese challenge.
So it's possible, but I don't think the Biden campaign has been very circumspect about rejoining TPP. So when the Trump administration withdrew, the other 11 Asian and Latin American members of TPP went forward and renamed it CPTPP. So the idea is that if America joins it, it becomes just simply TPP again. But I think for political reasons, it's difficult and challenging for Biden to talk about joining it. But I think also for economic reasons, there are real debates about how much American consumers and American businesses would really benefit from TPP. So it doesn't feel like a first-year initiative. Not really clear if it's an initiative you even do in your second year. The challenge is for people like Victor and I, the real virtue of TPP is the strategy component of it in terms of linking together like-minded economies, that could help push and prod China in a better direction, both on economic issues, but also on questions of diplomacy and security policy. So in a world where TPP is more of a strategy play than it is a pure economic play, I think you're unlikely to see rapid action by a new Biden administration.
Well, let me go back to Dr. Cha, but just on this issue of engaging multilaterally versus engaging unilaterally. Trump, that's another big break that Trump has made with our foreign policy practices, where he likes to go confrontational, one-on-one with another country, in particular with China, to the extent where he has antagonized many of our allies who are in the same boat versus China. What do you think, would be I guess I figured that Trump will go the same way, but is that the best way? Is there another way? Is there a possibility of changing it, or is this having positive results?
So I have a number of reactions to that question. I mean, I think the first is that this shift in U.S. China relations, really led by the United States to open strategic competition. It puts a lot of countries, allies and partners of the United States in positions that they've never been before, in the sense that the hedge space really has disappeared for a lot of these countries, where they have to make choices between the United States and China, and these are not easy choices. On the question of multilateralism, yes, I mean, I would imagine a Biden administration would be much more multilateral than a Trump administration has been, and the first and most important place being on, the pandemic and a recovery path from this pandemic. Trump has outright rejected any sort of multilateral effort on a vaccine and vaccine distribution. I could be wrong. I mean, I think one of the first things that a Biden administration would do in this regard would be to rejoin the WHO. But I could be wrong about that. But that's just the way I think that they might respond, and also to really, certainly to want to ensure that the United States fares well with a vaccine, but also to reject outright this sort of vaccine nationalism that we're seeing.
I see that China has taken a different tact, where they're using their possible vaccine. They said that they would share with their neighbors. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is that for one, the total absence of any sort of multilateral response to the pandemic is in no small part because the United States has taken such a self-help approach. I mean, it's in global crises like this, regardless of where you think U.S. power is, that the world instinctively looks to the United States and takes their cues from the United States. And that's not where we've been. And so China, ironically, has kind of stepped into this space and talked a good game about how they're a responsible stakeholder and they're predictable. I mean, compare the UN General Assembly speeches between the American UN General Assembly speech and the Chinese one. So I do think that there would be more multilateralism. Ironically, the one place where you've seen the Trump administration exercise multilateralism has been on these efforts to pull together coalitions to move supply chains out of China and to try to counter China's debt trap diplomacy on infrastructure, where they have been trying to pull together these coalitions involving allies and partners, allies like Japan and Korea and Australia, and partners like India and Thailand and Vietnam. So that, I guess you could consider that a form of multilateralism.
Right.
Except for the fact that none of it's worked.
None of it's worked, and no one really wants to sort of be put in a situation where they're forced to choose between one or the other side. So,
well, I have to ask, since we're on this subject and it's close to home, what's the scuttlebutt on the Chinese consulate here? Was that just a tit for tat approach that the U.S. did, or was there something really going on at the Chinese consulate here in Houston? Do y'all hear any scuttlebutt on that?
I don't know.
No, I mean, I would say among the China specialist community, nobody really knows what specifically was going on at the consulate, but it's clear that the Trump administration wanted to send a very strong signal that they didn't like the way China was using its embassies and how diplomats had been engaging with Chinese students and researchers who may or may not have, lied on their applications. I'm sure there was clearly some bad behavior on the part of the Chinese, but I think they wanted to just send a very, very strong, the Trump administration was trying to send a very, very strong signal, and they picked the consulate that they believed was sort of least costly to close, to send the Chinese a signal about students and researchers that they believed were abusing the U.S. visa system to get access to U.S. institutions.
Oh, well, then they closed our Wuhan consulate. Is that well? Right now, we're starting to get a lot of questions here, and I'm going to go to the audience here. They've actually I've told you some of their questions as we've gone along here, but let's see. Angela asks, what would support for Taiwan look like in a Biden versus a Trump administration? Let me start with you, Dr. Medeiros.
Yeah, I think U.S. support would look pretty robust. I think it would be different in the sense of a lot of the Trump administration's moves on Taiwan are not about Taiwan. They're about countering China, seeking to generate leverage with China, seeking to poke China, as opposed to initiatives that are about meeting American commitments to Taiwan's security, its prosperity, its international space. And so I think you'd probably see a greater consistency in U.S. initiatives. I mean, I can tell you, as somebody that lives in Washington, sort of one of the worst held secrets in Washington is that Trump has told his team, I don't care about Taiwan, don't mess with Taiwan. Taiwan will just screw up my trade deal with the Chinese, so don't create any problems. And that it was only once the U.S. China trade deal was signed in January of this year that finally some of his folks around him said, okay, can we do some stuff with Taiwan? And as a result, we've seen multiple arms sales deals announced this year. They've expressed interest in a free trade agreement. I would expect all of those initiatives to continue, but reflective of a much more comprehensive strategy. And then I also think you'd probably have greater success at U.S. engagement in multilateral organizations to create more international space for Taiwan, simply because America would be more credible in those organizations.
Okay. Kabish asks, both Biden and Trump have criticized China. China is sort of the big bogeyman, and both are sort of taking turns, lambasting it. But do we think that there will be a different approach between the two when it comes to China? Especially Xi Jinping. Trump has talked about his great relationship with Xi Jinping, has been very careful not to criticize Xi Jinping. What do you think, Dr. Cha?
So there's no denying that there's been a shift in the way the United States looks at China. In many ways, there was a dominant template for this relationship, the so-called responsible stakeholder template, or the liberal dream, if you will, with regard to China, embed them in international institutions and try to affect change and rule compliance that way. And I think we've seen on both sides, both on the Republican and the Democrat side, a real change over the last year or so, in which there's basically been a giving up of the responsible stakeholder template and calling the situation what it is, which is a China that clearly has become much more assertive, that is no longer, seeking to bide its time and peacefully rise, taking advantage of what they perceive as U.S. weakness, dating all the way back to the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And that the United States has to essentially accept that this is now a competition. And I think that will continue, whether it's Trump or Biden. I think that will, at least for the foreseeable future, be the template going forward. Now, how Vice President Biden talks about it, and how he talks about it to the American people, how he talks about it with our allies and partners, and how he talks about it with China, I think will be very different from the way that Trump does it. But to think that it wouldn't be a competitive template, I think would be wrong. And
this personal diplomacy, Trump seems to put great, stake in his ability to charm Xi Jinping or other world leaders to do his bidding. Do you think he's had some success with that approach with Xi Jinping and the trade agreements that they did strike?
I would say no, but I'd like to hear what Evan says, because I don't think it's certainly not worked with North Korea. I mean, arguably it's worked with Japan and Shinzo Abe, but I don't think it's worked overall.
Dr. Medeiros, what do you think?
Well, Dr. Cha and I have a colleague at Georgetown who's a real Japan expert who relayed to me that upon retiring from his prime ministership in Japan, one of the first things that Shinzo Abe said was, "I'm glad I left because Trump just exhausted me." Not terribly surprising. I very much agree with Victor. I don't think Trump's approach to China has really accomplished much. And while I do think that changing the framing and calling a spade, right, calling the relationship, framing it in terms of strategic competition, was important. It changed the American conversation, both among elites and the public, for the long term. But the question is, what strategic competition is a description of a relationship, or it's a description of a condition of a relationship. It's not a strategy. So the question is, how is it that you compete? What mix of incentives and disincentives applied bilaterally and multilateral? For your competitive strategies, how much of it is about America running faster? How much of it is slowing the other guy down? How much of it is deterring bad behavior? I mean, there are many different dimensions of strategic competition that I wish the Trump administration had systematically developed, because what happened was China policy basically became slap tariffs on them and negotiate a trade deal. Right. And that's not really China policy. China is too broad a challenge for America and the international community for the United States to have such a singular priority.
But we have to give Trump his due. As you say, he changed the attitude. He did alert the elites to the hollowing out of the manufacturing and the working class. That I'm an economist, so it's the economists think there is lots more than just the Chinese competition to it, but certainly they're acknowledging that Chinese competition and their ascension to the WHO, not the the world, not the WHO,
WTO, yeah.
The WTO in 2000 did have a negative impact.
My understanding is there a lot of economists have said that technology had a far greater role to play in reducing the labor intensity of manufacturing than anything China did. And to the extent that China contributed, and I do think that it did contribute to that sort of offshoring, none of that is coming back to the United States. So whacking China around makes you feel good, but it doesn't really get you very far, because if those jobs leave China, they'll go to Vietnam or Mexico or another lower middle income manufacturing hub.
Well, I have a question. Yes, sorry, Dr. Cha.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that this one of the initiatives they have is this economic prosperity network, which is trying to move supply chains, out of China, in part stemming from seeing the vulnerabilities of medical equipment supply chains when China shut down during COVID. but even in that case, as Evan said, that doesn't mean those supply chain jobs are coming back to the United States. They're going to Vietnam and Thailand.
Right.
They're not coming to the States.
Yeah, the U.S. trade policy has been the best thing to happen to Vietnam in decades for their economy. I do have to pat one of our listeners on the back, Tabish, who noted this particular thing. There's so much trade between the U.S. and China. We rely on them for so many essential products like PPE and essential drugs. Will these industries come back to the United States? And the answer is, even if we were tough, no, they're not. They're not going to come back to the U.S. And I guess I'll just add, Tim, I know the CEO of Apple has been approached by Trump many times to say, can you bring the production of the Apple phone back to the United States? And he just says, no, it's just, it's never coming back. Maybe we can bring some stuff, but it's just not cost effective.
I mean, I would say, Eddie, that Goldman Sachs has done a variety of different studies on this that they've shared with me. And the empirical evidence to date is that there has been some, movement of American manufacturers out of China, but to the extent that they've moved, it's largely in industries that we're going to have to move anyway because of rising land and labor costs in China. And that's largely in the sectors of, apparel in particular, apparel and footwear.
Right.
In sectors like healthcare and smartphones, some of them have stayed in China, some of them have moved to Vietnam, but it's more about diversification for the purposes of creating resilience in supply chains. So it's not really, China's not really losing anything. It's basically just giving manufacturers, the greater opportunity to hedge a little bit of risk if things go bad in the U.S.-China relationship. So a lot of the sort of very serious investment banks have looked at it, and the data to date just simply doesn't support a decoupling. If anything, in some sectors like electric vehicles, Tesla being a very obvious example, the investment in China is growing in large part because access to China's domestic market is so critical for a lot of global manufacturers.
Well, we could talk on this topic ad infinitum, but Saul raises a very interesting question here. Nearly 500 national security experts, both civilians and former senior uniformed officers, have endorsed Biden for president, saying Trump is not up to the security task. What impact would this have on the continued politicization of the military and the, bureaucracy, security bureaucracy, that is by tradition nonpartisan? I think that's a very interesting question. Both of y'all have been in those positions. What do you think about that? Let me start with Dr. Cha first.
So this is not my area of expertise, I would say. But I think we're seeing this now because of what I think many people see as the extraordinary situation that we're now in. Hopefully this doesn't set a precedent going forward. I think if regardless of whether you like future leaders or not, what side of the aisle you're on, if they're all within a certain band of reasonableness and operating within the bounds of the Constitution, then I think you wouldn't see this sort of outcry by military figures or former military figures signing on. So I'd like to believe that this is just symptomatic of the extraordinary circumstances under which we now are, and that this would not be a regular thing going forward.
So do you criticize these former security professionals for taking a very overt political stance in this election? Does that damage the our security institution going forward?
I personally, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think they are expressing views that I don't necessarily disagree with, and that I think many of our interests and our security equities around the world are being wasted, if not completely damaged, by the policies and the attitudes that this administration has followed in an extraordinary fashion. I mean, ones that are beyond the bounds of what we normally see as foreign policy, whether it's coming from Democrats or Republicans. And
let me play devil's advocate though here a little bit. This is, the traditional, view of, you say, well, keep it in the family. Talk to your colleagues privately, exert your influence to change policy in a way that you think is better for the country. But, when you go public, all of a sudden you kind of sully that influence, if you will. You have no influence in some sense.
Hey, Eddie, could I come in here?
Sure, please, Dr. Medeiros.
So I think one important distinction in understanding what we're debating is that many of the people that sign these various letters, for example, the military officials, are not active duty. Mm-hmm. So I think that your very good point about sort of keeping it in the family, staying apolitical, would be true for serving military officers or serving intelligence officers. For those that sign the letter, I think these are all people that have retired, and many of them have served in political positions. I believe that Dr. Cha even signed one of the letters, by former, all political appointees that have since left government service. So I think being in government service versus having retired and having served at a senior political level, some of those distinctions are important because, I think like Victor, we both have friends that serve in the military with great distinction, serve in the intelligence community with great distinction, and they deeply pride themselves on being apolitical in the service that they provide, even though that they feel as if that's been tested under the Trump administration. So I think those people are very, very careful. I think it's the more senior retired folks that decided to come out and be public. So I think it's just important to maintain that distinction when we're talking about what they did.
Okay. There's one last question here, and actually it's very topical. TikTok. I don't know if you're familiar with this app. It downloads the funny videos. One of the most popular apps on the web, owned by a Chinese company. The claim is that when you download it to your phone, it takes all this information and whatnot, and because it's a Chinese company, the claim is that the Chinese are using it to get our information. So the Trump administration has decreed, and I'm not really sure what their authority is, that they must sell a portion of TikTok to, or at least the U.S. subsidiary, to an American company. And they recently came to an agreement where Oracle is going to buy 20% of TikTok. And I guess I saw an interesting comment by a Wall Street observer who said, well, let's see, we have a government that's forcing the sale of a company to a supporter of the leader of the country, but it's not communist. It's the United States. Do you think these sorts of issues, or this particular issue, for example, is making an impact in the world and hurting our commercial reputation out there? Let me ask Dr. Cha.
Well, I don't really follow the TikTok issue so Evan, I think, would have the right answer to that. I'll just say that while I understand the sentiment behind the question, I think we're also entering a period in history where there's much more concern about weaponization of things like artificial intelligence and next generation wireless and these sorts of things. And much as I don't particularly like the way this particular issue has been framed publicly and what's been said about publicly, I do understand that given that trend, that there's going to have to be more cooperation between government and private sector when it comes to data security, data privacy, and problems like this going forward. So, but I'll let Evan speak to this.
And I'll let it actually be a little quick, Evan, because we're right up here on the hour.
Yeah, I generally agree with Victor. I mean, I have deep concerns about data privacy and data security when it involves China. I have deep concerns about China's use of cyber tools for espionage and economic espionage. The Trump administration has not done a very good job of explaining the national security risks and the legal basis for forcing a foreign company to divest their American assets, I think is really substantial and looks, I think it's fairly specious. And then, allowing the friend of the president to buy it. So it looks pretty bad internationally on multiple different levels. So
but there are legitimate security reasons to pursue this. Well, gentlemen, I would love to sit here all night and talk to you about many other issues we haven't had a chance to touch on. Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, we didn't get to those, but our time is at an end. So thank you very much from the Asian Society Texas Center for joining us. And thank you, our listeners out there. We offer over 150 public programs each year on arts, culture, business, and policy. Many of these programs are free and made possible by strong financial support by members and friends. But we hope you would consider your support tonight by texting Asia Society TX to 243-725. That's 243-725. Thank you for your consideration. I'd also like to ask you to tune in next Thursday, October 1st at 7:30 Central for a discussion with Khan Academy's founder and CEO, Sal Khan. Khan Academy, if you don't know, is this great, innovative online educational innovator. And Sal Khan has been featured across all sorts of media, and he will discuss issues related to educational equity amid COVID-19, and also insights on how students, parents, and educators can be best prepared to adapt for distance learning and what the classroom might look like post-COVID. Learn more about these upcoming webcasts at our website. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in as well. Good night.